The night was cold on the edge of the galaxy, a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the stars themselves. A dying outpost hung broken in the void, its lights flickering like the last heartbeat of something once alive. She lay there among the twisted metal and drifting debris, her breathing shallow, her silver blood spilling slowly into the blackness of space. Once, her people had promised that no soldier would ever be left behind. Once, she believed them. But when the enemy came and the skies tore apart, they fled. They left her where she fell, alone, bleeding, and forgotten on a battlefield no one cared to remember. The distant beacons that once carried her empire's proud signal were now silent. No rescue ships, no voices, just the sound of the station groaning under its own death. And for the first time, she felt something her kind had always mocked humans for feeling: fear. She tried calling them first. Her people, her commanders, her emperor. She sent signal after signal, each weaker than the last. No one answered. It was not that they couldn't. It was that they wouldn't. She was no longer useful. She was a casualty they'd already written off. The war had moved on to richer systems, cleaner battles, the kind they could win without dirtying their hands. But as she lay among the wreckage, the stars above her blurred and dimmed, a thought came unbidden. A dangerous thought. A human one. Her hand, trembling and slick with blood, reached for the emergency frequency. One that no alien commander dared to use unless they were truly desperate. It was not the Council's channel. It was older, quieter, built on promises no one liked to admit still held power. It was the frequency of Earth. The moment she pressed it, she expected silence. Humanity wasn't supposed to care. They didn't owe her people anything. Her empire had stood against them more than once. They'd sneered at Earth in the great chambers of the Galactic Council. Humans were the ones the other species feared in whispers, not because they were the strongest, but because they were the ones who always came back. But she didn't have anyone else to call. So she whispered through the static, barely forming the words. "This is Princess Elira of the Shalvaran Empire," she breathed, her voice weak. "If anyone can hear me, I'm still here." The signal vanished into the black. She waited. A minute passed. 2. 10. Her heart slowed, her mind drifting. Then a crackle. A low, steady voice cut through the static like a knife through fog. "We hear you." 3 words. Calm. Human. Something inside her snapped awake. They weren't supposed to come. They shouldn't come. But humans were never good at following the rules written by others. By the time the Council even registered her distress beacon, it was already too late. A Terran rescue fleet had crossed the silent border. They didn't ask permission. They didn't need to. Black hulls emerged from hyperspace like shadows peeling back the night, their engines burning cold blue. They didn't send diplomatic messages. They sent drop pods. Humanity didn't talk about saving someone. They just did it. The Council had called them reckless, dangerous, unpredictable. She lay on the cracked floor of the station and watched as a hatch burst open and armored figures stormed through the smoke. Their boots were heavy, their movements precise, their faces hidden behind dark visors. The leader knelt beside her, scanning the wounds, voice calm and steady. "Stay with me," he said. "We've got you." As they lifted her onto the stretcher, she realized this wasn't how her people operated. Her people would have weighed the value of a rescue against the cost of fuel, the risk of attack, the loss of political capital. Humans didn't. They saw a signal. They came. It wasn't their world. It wasn't their war. But they came anyway. That was what made them dangerous. Not their guns. Not their ships. Their choice. But the moment the humans crossed the border, the Council noticed. Encrypted channels lit up across the galaxy. Earth interfered where it should not. They moved without permission. "They are breaking the balance." They said it with outrage because underneath, they were afraid. For decades, humanity had played by the rules, not because it wanted to, but because it was watching. Waiting. The Council had left Elira to die as if she were a piece of trash. Humanity's rescue wasn't just an act of compassion. It was a statement. and the entire galaxy heard it loud and clear. The enemy who had abandoned the station noticed too. Within hours, their warships appeared on the scanners, a vast fleet stretching like a curtain of steel across the stars. Their goal wasn't to fight humanity, they simply wanted her dead. To erase the evidence. To make her silence permanent. But they didn't expect to find a Terran strike group waiting for them. The humans did not retreat. They stood between her broken body and the empire that had left her behind. They had no treaty that bound them to her. No oath. Only their own decision. The first shot was fired by the enemy. The second was fired by Earth. What followed wasn't a skirmish. It was a message. The Terran fleet moved like a machine forged in the dark. They didn't shout over comms. They didn't demand surrender. Every blast was precise. Every maneuver was final. The enemy fleet, 10 times larger, expected the humans to break. Instead, they bled. Elira, weak and barely conscious, watched through the medbay window as the black ships of Earth carved through her enemy's armada. She couldn't hear the sounds of the battle, but she could feel it, the rhythm of something unstoppable. The Galactic Council sent warnings, diplomatic channels bursting with demands to retreat. Humanity ignored them. They had received a call for help. That was enough. And as the last enemy cruiser cracked in half, as the stars burned bright with fire and debris, Elira understood why the other empires feared them. Humanity was not the strongest species in the galaxy, but they were the most relentless. Once they moved, they didn't stop. When she woke days later aboard a Terran medical ship, her wounds were gone but her mind was storming. Her own people had written her off. But humans had bled for someone they didn't owe anything to. She expected to be treated like a political pawn, a prisoner, or worse. But the humans treated her like she mattered. The captain visited her every day, not with speeches or demands, but with simple words. You're safe. That's what matters. Meanwhile, the council fractured. Some empires condemned humanity. Others whispered in the shadows, asking if maybe Earth was right. Because if they could leave the princess of an empire to die, what did that say about all the others? Fleets shifted. Old treaties cracked. And the name of Earth began to spread through the cracks like fire. Elira returned to her home world not as a victim but as something far more dangerous, a living symbol. When she stepped into the council chamber, their voices fell silent. Her empire had abandoned her. Humanity had not. I called, she said softly, her voice echoing through the hall, and they answered. Not because they had to, because they chose to. In that single moment, the old powers felt something they hadn't in centuries: shame. The council tried to paint Earth as reckless aggressors, but their words faltered against the weight of her presence. Other species began to send signals toward Earth, quiet and cautious. They didn't trust easily, but they understood one thing. When no one else came, the humans did. From that day, the galaxy changed. Earth hadn't planned an empire. It didn't need to. The simple act of answering a call in the dark had shifted the balance of power. And every world, friend or foe, now knew what it meant to whisper into the void and hear a human voice answer, "We hear you." If you enjoyed this HFY sci-fi story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more cinematic tales of humanity's rise among the stars. Your support helps bring these stories to life, and remember, when the galaxy turns its back, humanity listens. The council chamber was alive with noise that day, a storm of raised voices and flickering holograms casting sharp light across the room. Elira's signal had reached more ears than she'd ever imagined. No one said it aloud, but they all knew the truth. She was supposed to die out there. That outpost was never meant to be rescued. She was a liability, a loose end in a war that no one wanted to talk about in the open. Yet her name echoed now through every corridor, every channel, because of one impossible detail. It hadn't been her people who came for her. It hadn't been the council. It had been the humans. The very species that half the galaxy had spent decades trying to keep in a cage of laws, treaties, and whispered warnings. Humanity had moved without permission. They had crossed borders the council swore were untouchable. And they did it for someone who wasn't even their own. Behind closed doors, The panic was louder than the speeches. In the upper chamber, the rulers of great empires spoke in low, heated tones. "Do you understand what they've done?" hissed the representative of the Ikri Dominion. "They've sent warships into a council conflict zone without clearance. If they're allowed to act this way, no border is safe." A feathered diplomat struck the table with her talons. "No one has ever dared to ignore a direct council directive like this," she spat. "Not even the warlords of old." The Speaker of the Council, an ancient being of glass-like skin and hollow eyes, spoke last. Its voice was soft, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "That's because no one else is human." In every corner of the chamber, the word human carried a weight that no one wanted to admit out loud. Humanity was not the largest empire. They didn't have the most ships, or the most advanced technology. But they had something the others did not. A reputation that lived in the quiet corners of every empire. The stories of battles they had survived. Wars they should have lost but didn't. How they built fleets out of nothing. How they fought until there was nothing left to take from them. The other empires feared them not because of what they were, but because of what they became when cornered. Meanwhile, Elira's own people faced the backlash of their silence. News had spread fast. Their princess, their own blood, had been left behind without a second thought. Holoscreens across neutral worlds played the footage of Terran Marines carrying her out of the burning outpost, their dark armor scorched but unbroken. It was a single moment, but it shook the foundations of the old alliances. How could an empire speak of strength when a human fleet had done what they would not? And worse, they hadn't even asked for a reward. On Earth, the situation unfolded in a very different way. There were no grand speeches, no chest-beating declarations, just quiet, measured readiness. In a dark war room buried deep beneath the planet's surface, Terran commanders studied council movements. Their ships hadn't been sent to make a statement. They'd been sent because someone called for help. That was enough. "They'll respond," one admiral said calmly. "They can't allow us to make this kind of rescue without consequence. It's not about her. It's about control." Another leaned back, almost smiling. "Then let them come. They think we play their games. We don't." The princess, still weak but recovering, sat in the medical wing of a Terran ship as Earth's blue and black colors flickered outside her window. She didn't understand it. In her culture, you didn't move fleets without purpose, without profit. But the humans had done exactly that, for someone they'd been taught to call their rival. One of the medics adjusted the monitors beside her bed. "You don't owe us anything," he said without looking up. "We don't work that way." She stared at him in silence, trying to grasp the strangeness of it. Every lesson she'd been raised with about humanity was wrong. Back in the council, plans were already being written in shadows. Humanity had embarrassed them on the largest stage imaginable. Not with an attack. Not with words. With an act of defiance wrapped in compassion. That was more dangerous than any weapon. Because it made people question why the council didn't act. Why they never acted. In small corners of the galaxy, on distant stations and half-forgotten colonies, whispers began to spread. "If I ever get left behind, maybe the humans will come." The council couldn't allow that. So they called it a violation of galactic law. They drafted resolutions. They scheduled emergency meetings. They painted Earth as reckless, dangerous, unstable. But the cracks were already there, spreading like fractures in glass. Because everyone had seen the same thing. A Terran fleet answering a call no one else dared to. A princess pulled from the fire not by the empire she was born to, but by strangers who didn't owe her a single breath. And for the first time in a long time, the galaxy began to ask itself a dangerous question. Who really held power here? The ones who ruled by fear, or the ones who answered when no one else would? Elira, watching from her window aboard the Terran flagship, didn't need anyone to explain what came next. The council would not forgive this. The old empires would rally. Warships would gather. And everything she thought she knew about the balance of power in the galaxy was about to burn. She wasn't afraid anymore. Because when she called for help, the council ignored her. Humanity didn't. And that truth was already louder than any council decree. Elira sat beneath the soft light of the Terran medbay as the hum of the ship's engines vibrated faintly beneath her fingers. She could still smell smoke on her skin, the kind that never really left you after a battlefield. The humans had patched her wounds, replaced the air she'd been gasping for, and spoken to her with a kind of quiet certainty she wasn't used to. In her empire, rescue was conditional. Help came only when it benefited those above you. But the humans hadn't asked her to swear loyalty. They hadn't demanded payment or obedience. They had simply come. And that single fact hung in her chest heavier than any weight she'd ever carried. She wasn't used to being saved by people she'd been taught to fear. Outside her window, she could see the endless black of space, cut only by the cold silver lines of Terran ships gliding in formation. There was a silence in their movements, not the forced silence of fear but the measured stillness of people who understood war too well. She watched a formation of fighters peel away from the main fleet, the faint glow of their engines vanishing into the dark. They didn't know that she was watching them with a strange mixture of awe and dread. These were the same humans who once defied entire empires, who fought when no one else dared. And now, their quiet was beginning to make the rest of the galaxy nervous. On the other side of the galaxy, in the council chamber, that nervousness had already turned into fury. 1,000 ambassadors spoke at once, their translated voices overlapping like a storm. "This is a violation of council law," one snarled. "Earth has crossed the border of sovereign space," another shouted. But beneath the noise, there was something else they didn't want to name aloud: fear. Humanity had ignored them, not with arrogance, but with terrifying calm. They had not asked for permission. They had not explained themselves. They simply acted. And everyone in that room knew what that meant. The balance of power was tilting. Meanwhile, Elira's people, the very ones who had left her behind, were scrambling to rewrite the story. In public, their diplomats called her loss a tragic accident, a communications failure, a strategic retreat. Behind closed doors, they cursed her for surviving. She was supposed to be a quiet footnote in a war they didn't want to talk about. Instead, she had become a living reminder of their cowardice, and worse, she had been saved by the one species the Council wanted to keep contained. The Shulveran Empire, proud and cold, found itself facing whispers in every corner of its domain. They left their own to die. The humans didn't. Those whispers spread faster than any fleet. Back on the Terran flagship, the ship's captain entered her room. He was a tall man, his uniform plain and his expression steady. There was something about him that unnerved her, not because he was cruel, but because he wasn't. "How are you feeling?" he asked simply. She stiffened, unused to being asked questions that weren't loaded with expectation. "Alive," she said softly. He nodded. "That's enough for now. No threats, no negotiations. Just quiet humanity." She didn't realize how much it unnerved her until he was gone. Elsewhere on the ship, Terran officers gathered in the war room. The Council's broadcasts were clear. Earth would be punished for its reckless defiance. Fleets were already being redeployed. Border systems were lighting up like storm clouds. But there was no fear in the humans' faces, only the kind of sharp focus that comes from knowing what happens when the world turns against you. They'd been here before. Alone. Outnumbered. Unwelcome. And every time, they had survived. Elira overheard fragments of their briefings in the corridors. They spoke in simple, clear words, about logistics, about strategies, about protecting her. Protecting her. She had to stop at one point, pressing a hand against the cool wall, letting that thought settle in. Her own people had decided she wasn't worth the risk. The humans were risking war for her. It wasn't rational. It wasn't political. And that made it more terrifying than anything she'd ever known. In the following days, she watched Terran Marines train in the ship's lower bays. Their movements were brutal but controlled. They didn't look like conquerors. They looked like survivors who refused to bend to anyone. They moved with the weight of a people who had fought for every inch of ground they stood on. And somewhere deep in her chest, something began to shift. Her entire life she'd been taught to look down on them, to see them as a threat that needed to be contained, as beasts with fire in their veins. But what she saw wasn't savagery. It was resolve. It was something she had never found among her own. Back at the council, new plots took shape. "She must not speak," said one of the elder members. "If the princess tells the galaxy the truth, we lose control of the narrative. Humanity will become a symbol." In the hidden halls of power, they signed orders, sent assassins, whispered of removing the problem. Because Elira, the abandoned one, was no longer a tragedy. She was a spark, a living reminder that the council's strength was built on empty promises. But they were already too late. Her story had begun to spread on its own. The station she'd nearly died on was a ruin now, but the human rescue logs were not. Holos of Terran Marines carrying her broken body through fire played across dozens of worlds. For some, it was proof of humanity's recklessness. But for many, it was proof of something else, of a people who did not walk away when the rest of the galaxy did. Elira lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling of her cabin as the engines hummed around her. She thought of the men and women who had carried her out of that wreck without knowing her name. She thought of the captain who asked how she felt without asking what she could offer in return. And she thought of the empire that had decided she wasn't worth saving. She clenched her fist, feeling the pulse of something that frightened her more than death ever had: loyalty. Not to her people, but to them. In that moment, she realized something the council feared but never said out loud. If humanity ever stopped standing alone, if they ever inspired others to stand with them, the galaxy would change forever. And now, without even meaning to, she had given them the spark that could start that fire. The stars over the Terran fleet burned cold and distant the night everything began to shift. The humans didn't need words to know that the galaxy was tightening around them. They could see it in the way trade lanes began to close without warning, how council patrols lingered longer than they should, how diplomatic channels that once buzzed with empty pleasantries now carried only silence. Silence, in the galaxy, was never neutral. It was a weapon, a quiet threat, and the humans had felt it before. They recognized the weight of a gathering storm. What the council didn't understand was that humanity had learned how to live in storms a long time ago. The Shulveran Empire, Elira's people, had already issued their official statement, a careful, polished lie about a tragic miscommunication and operational oversight. But everyone in the galaxy knew what that really meant. They had left her to die and hoped no one would notice. Only someone did notice. The humans had answered a call no one else would touch. And now the balance of power trembled like a loose blade. Fleets began to shift quietly, old alliances whispering behind locked doors, calculating who would survive if this grew into war. The Council didn't want a war with Earth, not openly. They wanted a warning to echo through the stars. They wanted humanity to step back. But they had forgotten one simple thing: humans don't step back. They dig in. On the bridge of the Terran flagship, the crew moved like clockwork. No panic, no fear, just preparation. They'd seen enough of the galaxy to know what came next. Earth wasn't the biggest player on the board, but they were the one no one could predict. A faint red light pulsed on the main screen, a signal from one of the border patrol fleets. Council warships were massing in neutral space, not attacking, not declaring anything official, just watching. That was how these things always started. Watching, waiting, making humans feel the pressure. But pressure had never broken humanity. It had only made them sharper. Elira stood at the edge of the observation deck, hands pressed against the cold glass as she stared at the distant glow of council ships forming a blockade. She knew that formation. She'd seen it used before, on conquered worlds, on those who defied council directives. She'd watched other nations fold beneath it. "They are trying to make them flinch," she whispered to herself. Behind her, the captain approached, his boots quiet on the steel floor. "It won't work," he said simply, as if reading her thoughts. "We don't flinch." Her chest tightened at the certainty in his voice. She had grown up among leaders who cloaked their fear in layers of politics. But the humans didn't cloak anything. They didn't need to. Their calm wasn't arrogance. It was a promise. That terrified the Council more than any warship. Meanwhile, on the Council world, powerful voices met in secret halls carved from silver and crystal. They spoke of humanity like a disease. They must be reminded who holds the stars, hissed one ambassador. If they defy us now, others will follow. Then we crush them, another answered coldly. We isolate their fleets. No allies. No supply lines. One mistake and Earth burns. But not everyone in the chamber agreed. A few older voices remembered the last time the galaxy tried to burn Earth. They remembered how humanity had refused to die. You'll start something none of us can stop, one whispered. The others ignored them. Pride was louder than wisdom. The princess, meanwhile, was pulled between two worlds. Her people had branded her a political liability, a spark that threatened their standing in the council. The humans, on the other hand, had not asked her for loyalty. They hadn't even asked her for thanks. But their ships had carried her out of fire when her own left her behind. It wasn't allegiance that burned in her chest now. It was something far more dangerous to the council. It was faith. Not in their systems, not in their power, but in these quiet, stubborn Terrans who acted when others talked. The blockade thickened day by day. Council fleets cut off trade, communications, movement. Neutral worlds began pulling back their ships, terrified of getting caught in the crossfire. The political machine that had kept humanity in check for decades was awakening again. But Earth wasn't the same as it had been before. Their fleets were faster now. Smarter. Their people had learned to fight wars no one else wanted to fight. And they had allies, even if the Council didn't see them yet. In the lower decks of the flagship, Terran Marines moved like a single living thing. Elira watched them train, their boots pounding against the steel floors in rhythm. She had been raised among warriors too, but these soldiers were different. There was no pomp, no ceremony, no promise of glory. There was just grit. She had seen their faces up close, scarred, tired, determined. They weren't fighting for conquest. They were fighting because someone had to. Because when everyone else turns away, someone has to stand and say no more. The first real threat came without warning. A council frigate crossed into Terran patrol space, not firing, but testing. It was a maneuver older than the council itself. Push the line. See who blinks. The humans didn't blink. Their response was cold and surgical. Within seconds of the incursion, the Terran ships repositioned with flawless precision, cutting off the frigate's escape. No shots fired. No speeches. Just the weight of quiet steel in the dark. The council commander, expecting hesitation, found himself staring down an entire formation of warships that radiated the kind of calm that didn't need words. He withdrew. The line didn't move. That single moment rippled through the galaxy like a crack in a frozen lake. It was small. A skirmish that wasn't a skirmish. But it told everyone watching that humanity wasn't going to fold. That if the council wanted this war, they'd have to bleed for it. Back in her quarters, Elira sat in silence, the distant hum of engines steady beneath her. She realized something the council had never truly understood. Humans didn't fight because they wanted power. They fought because they couldn't stand watching injustice from the sidelines. They had come for her when no one else would. And now, with the weight of the galaxy pressing down, they stood without flinching. On the other side of space, council commanders stared at the growing reports with unease. The blockade wasn't working. Fear wasn't working. The humans should have backed down by now. But humanity didn't obey the rules the council had spent centuries writing. And now, for the first time in generations, the old powers felt something unfamiliar clawing at their throats. Not anger. Not annoyance. Fear. Elira rose from her seat and turned toward the stars. She wasn't human. She didn't belong to Earth. But in that moment, with the galaxy leaning toward war, she knew exactly who she would stand with. Not because they asked her to, but because they didn't have to. Humanity didn't rescue her to win a throne. They rescued her because someone needed saving. And that, more than any fleet or council law, was power. The blockade did not break the Terrans. It hardened them. For weeks, the council tightened its grip like a predator circling prey, expecting humanity to panic, to beg, to fold. But the humans didn't fold. They adapted. The moment the council thought it was cornering them, They were already laying out quiet, surgical plans behind the dark glass of their war rooms. Their fleets moved through the void like whispers, slipping between sectors the Council thought it controlled. Supply lines stayed alive. Communications hummed beneath encrypted channels no one could crack. The humans didn't rage against the pressure. They thrived under it. And that terrified the Council more than anything else. On Earth, in the underground command complex that had seen more wars than the Council dared to count, old generals stood before glowing star maps. They had seen this strategy before, not from the Council, but from history itself. "They're trying to choke us," one said calmly, hands behind his back. "Let them try," another answered with a thin, cold smile. "They think pressure breaks us. They don't remember who we are." The Terran High Command didn't panic. They sharpened their claws. Humanity had built its strength not on dominance, but on survival. When the galaxy closed its doors, Earth built its own. Meanwhile, the Council began to fracture under its own weight. Not all of its members agreed with the blockade. Some worlds had grown used to Terran trade, supplies that kept their factories alive, their people fed, their fleets moving. When the Council cut Earth off, it also cut those worlds off. Starving empires have short patience. Behind closed doors, whispers grew louder. If Earth fell, they'd all bleed. Humanity was the piece the Council had always underestimated, but the one that held more threads together than anyone dared admit. Elira walked the halls of the Terran flagship, her eyes catching every detail. The worn but polished steel, the quiet discipline of the crew, the way the Marines carried themselves like a single heartbeat. She had spent her entire life surrounded by empires that used power like a blunt blade, loud, heavy, brutal. But the Terrans used power like a scalpel. Precise, sharp, unapologetically direct. Every inch of their ship felt alive, like it carried a quiet fury that didn't need to be spoken aloud. She passed by the mess hall, where soldiers talked in low voices, laughing between themselves like war was something they had made peace with long ago. They didn't wear fear on their faces. And that, she realized, was why the Council was terrified of them. On the border, the tension cracked. It began as a small, almost invisible skirmish, a Council patrol testing Terran resolve. But when their ships strayed too close, the humans responded. Not with hesitation. Not with threats. But with brutal precision. Terran interceptors sliced through their formation before they could even react, disabling 3 ships without firing a single kill shot. It wasn't a war. It was a warning. The message carried through every listening post in the galaxy. Humanity wasn't cornered. Humanity was waiting. The Council's high chamber was chaos. Representatives shouted over one another, blaming each other for the escalating situation. They should have surrendered by now, one barked, slamming his clawed hand against the table. "This is what happens when you give humans too much freedom," another hissed. But the oldest among them, those who remembered the first wars with Earth, said nothing. Because they knew, the moment you backed humanity into a corner, they didn't kneel. They bit. And once they bit, they didn't let go. The princess had become an unintended symbol. The Council wanted her gone, silenced, erased from the story. But every broadcast, every whisper on neutral worlds carried her name. The girl who was left behind. The humans who answered. It spread like wildfire, and no blockade could stop it. For every world that feared Earth, 2 more began to question the Council. If humanity would come for one stranger, what else were they capable of? As pressure mounted, fleets across the galaxy began to move in ways the Council hadn't predicted. Small nations started opening their borders to Terran traders in secret. Pirates and mercenaries, who once avoided Earth out of fear, began offering quiet alliances. Even some Council military captains hesitated to fire on Terran ships, remembering the stories of battles where humanity had stood alone and still won. The Council had planned to isolate Earth. Instead, it had given them a stage. In orbit, the humans prepared, not like conquerors, but like survivors. The fleet wasn't designed for ceremony or spectacle. It was built to fight and to endure. Commanders studied every inch of the blockade, marking weaknesses, counting response times, memorizing patterns like wolves studying a fence. They didn't roar into battle. They waited for the moment the council overreached. And everyone in the command center knew that moment would come. It always did. Elira stood beside the captain on the bridge, watching a tactical map light up with council ships. "They think they can squeeze you," she whispered. He didn't take his eyes off the display. "They are not the first," he said quietly. "They won't be the last." She looked at him then, really looked at him. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't threatening. He was stating a fact. A truth carved into humanity's bones. Elsewhere, the council leaders began to realize the mistake they had made. The blockade that was meant to break Earth was now breaking them. Their fleets were stretched thin. Their allies were restless. And worse, their fear of humanity had become obvious. Fear was a dangerous thing. It didn't just control. It infected. It spread. It made people question why they followed those who were afraid. The final spark came when a council battle group pushed too deep into Terran space, convinced humanity would finally retreat. Instead, the Terran fleet surrounded them with surgical precision. Not a single warning shot was fired. No demand was made. The council commander saw black hulls on every screen, surrounding them like a storm swallowing light. His fleet folded in under 5 minutes. Not a single Terran casualty. That encounter ripped through the galaxy like a shockwave. The council had brought the noose, and humanity had turned it into a blade. The story of the abandoned princess was no longer a whisper, it was a banner. People began choosing sides, not because humanity demanded it, but because they saw where the tide was moving. Humanity didn't have to speak to inspire others. Their actions screamed for them. Elira stood at the viewport, watching the council fleets pull back just enough to breathe. In their hesitation, she saw the truth. They were no longer the hunters. Humanity was no longer prey. The storm had shifted. The council had made its move. And now it was Earth's turn. The galaxy's storm finally broke, not with a roar, but with a silence so heavy that even the stars seemed to hold their breath. Council fleets hung across the void like a shattered crown, spread thin by their own arrogance, their ships flashing warning lights as their crews waited for an order that would never come. For months they had tried to crush Earth with pressure, isolation, and fear. But Earth had stood still. Not by shouting. Not by begging. By enduring. And endurance was something no empire in the galaxy did better than humanity. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and everyone, every captain, every admiral, every watching world, could feel it in their bones. On the bridge of the Terran flagship, the atmosphere was sharp and calm. The stars outside were littered with the scattered formation of council vessels. Terran ships held position like wolves at the edge of a wounded herd. They had waited for this moment with the patience of people who had learned the value of silence. And when humanity finally moved, it was with the certainty of those who had already accepted the cost of war long ago. "They're overextended," one officer reported, eyes fixed on the tactical map. "Their supply lines are stretched. Their response times are slow. If we push now," the captain nodded once, "nothing more." "We don't push," he said quietly. "We end it." Across the galaxy, Elira's name had become more than just a headline. It was a spark turned wildfire. Planets once loyal to the Council now watched the Terran fleet with something the Council hadn't felt in centuries. Doubt. Doubt in their power. Doubt in their inevitability. Humanity had answered one forgotten cry for help, and that single act had exposed the truth. The Council's strength was built on fear, not loyalty. And fear had begun to crack. The Council's high chamber burned with panic. "We can still crush them," one ambassador barked. "If we strike now, strike with what?" Another interrupted, slamming a clawed hand against the glowing table. "Half our fleets are already stretched thin. The rest are guarding our own borders. And the outer sectors are whispering about neutrality. Do you not see it? We're alone." The Speaker of the Council, ancient and pale, looked out at the stars with something the others didn't want to name: resignation. "No one has ever beaten them by making them desperate," it said softly. "Not once in recorded history." The Terran fleet began to move. Black hulls shifted into formation like a blade sliding free of its sheath. There was no grand declaration, no roar of engines that shook the galaxy. Just quiet precision. Where the Council commanded with threats and proclamations, the humans simply acted. They targeted supply chains first, those invisible arteries that kept the Council's fleets alive. Docks went dark. Outposts fell silent. Communication relays that had pulsed for decades went black. The Council fleets weren't crushed in open battle. They were bled out. Slowly. Methodically. Elira stood on the bridge beside the Terran captain, her silver eyes locked on the map as the glowing red of Council ships flickered and dimmed one by one. She'd grown up surrounded by power wrapped in ceremony, by generals who shouted their strength into the void. But the humans didn't shout. They showed. "You're not just fighting them," she whispered. The captain's gaze didn't move from the stars. "We're showing everyone they were never gods," he answered. When the Council finally launched its desperate counterattack, it came like a storm without thunder. A massive fleet, larger than anything humanity had faced since the First Wars, emerged from hyperspace, a wall of metal meant to crush, not to fight. But what they didn't understand was that Earth wasn't a wall. Earth was a knife. The Terran formation split the void with a precision that made even their enemies hesitate. Arcs of blue energy lit the darkness as Terran interceptors struck first, carving holes in the outer defenses before the Council could form up. Arthalan ships, now fully committed to the human side, swept through those gaps like silver fire. The Council fleet had size. Humanity had will. And in war, will wins. The battle didn't last days. It lasted hours. The Council, so used to others bending to its power, had never learned to fight like humanity. They stumbled, they broke formation, they tried to retreat, but humanity gave them no space to breathe. In the end, their greatest armada shattered against Terran steel like a wave against rock. The Council flagship, a colossal vessel once believed invincible, cracked in half under the coordinated fire of Terran cruisers. Its lights went out. Its banners fell. And the silence that followed was louder than any victory cheer. On the ground, watching the streams of the battle play out, entire star systems erupted in disbelief. No one had ever seen the Council lose. No one had ever dared to imagine it. And now, with their fleets scattered like ash in the void, an old fear crumbled and something new took its place: hope. Hope that the galaxy didn't belong to those who ruled it through fear. Hope that the old order wasn't untouchable after all. The Council leaders, broken and pale, were brought to the chamber they had once ruled like gods. The captain stood before them, not in ceremonial armor, but in the plain black uniform of Earth's fleet. Elira stood at his side. She didn't belong to Earth, but she had chosen to stand there. The speaker looked up at the Terran officer with eyes like fading glass. "What will you do to us?" it whispered. The captain's answer was quiet. "What you never would have done. We'll let the galaxy choose its own future." The surrender sent shockwaves through the stars. Planets that had knelt for centuries raised their heads. Empires that once feared the Council began to breathe again. Humanity did not claim their throne. They broke it. They scattered the Council's authority like dust in solar wind. No forced allegiance. No empire. Just the quiet understanding that the galaxy would no longer kneel to fear. For Elira, it was the final fracture between who she had been and who she had become. She had once been the forgotten one, abandoned on a dying station. Now she was the living reminder of the moment the galaxy changed. And she had stood at the center of it, not as a conqueror, but as a witness to what happens when humanity answers a call. The Terran fleet returned to Earth in silence. No parades. No banners. No speeches carved in gold. They didn't need them. Their victory wasn't about glory. It was about sending a message that would echo across the stars for generations. If you call in the dark, Earth will answer. And so the galaxy moved into a new age, not ruled by one voice, but by many. Humanity hadn't conquered the stars. They'd reminded them what it meant to stand. Elira stood at the edge of the Terran flagship, looking out at the endless void. She remembered that cold station, the taste of blood in her mouth, the hopelessness that nearly swallowed her. She whispered into the silence, You came for me. If you enjoyed this HFY sci-fi story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more cinematic tales of humanity's rise among the stars. Your support helps bring these stories to life, and remember, when no one else answers, humanity will.